Welcome to the Presidential Plenary of the Society for Personality and Social Psychology Annual Convention. Please welcome your 2026 Convention Committee Chair, Michelle C.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the 2026 SPSP Annual Convention. This year's SPSP Annual Convention has brought together 3,547 researchers from 25 countries around the world, reflecting the global reach of our field. We are especially proud to welcome 2018 student presenters whose work and perspectives represent the future of personality and social psychology. Supporting and elevating the next generation of scholars has always been central to SPSP's mission. And their presence here is a powerful reminder of that commitment. Let's give a big round of applause to these remarkable members of our community. I would now like to acknowledge the invaluable contributions of more than 230 dedicated reviewers who generously gave their time and expertise to peer review submissions for this year's convention. With 2,300 submissions, each reviewed by at least 2 reviewers, this was no small undertaking. Peer reviewers are truly the backbone of our program, and this meeting would not be possible without their care, rigor, and commitment to the field. I also offer a special word of thanks to those whose tireless efforts throughout the year have brought this convention to life. On behalf of the members, thank you to the wonderful staff, Rachel Puffer, Michelle Jester, Teresa Martin, Lorenzo Figueroa, Lisa Russo, Joe Traglia, and Stephen Waldron. So if you're here, could you just stand up and say hi to everyone? There's the amazing Rachel. Woo! Your dedication does not go unnoticed, and we are deeply grateful. I'd also like to extend a heartfelt thank you to our exhibitors and sponsors, whose generous support helps make this convention possible. I encourage you to spend time in the exhibit hall, connect with our exhibitors, and explore the resources and opportunities they offer. You may discover tools, partnerships, or ideas that meaningfully support your work. Last but certainly not least, I express my sincere gratitude to the members of the convention committee whose generous volunteer work has made all of this possible. Mary coordinated our diversity, equity, inclusion, and anti-racism efforts. Corinne coordinated the awards symposium. Nathaniel and Michael coordinated professional development programming. Colin is our student representative who provides valuable input during meetings. Tosin and Oliver coordinated the symposia programming. And Chu-Jun and Cassie managed the single presenter programming. So we've had a very diverse team with scholars from across the world. The diversity of this year's convention committee mirrors the diversity of our community, which is here to foster fruitful exchanges of research ideas and to strengthen our sense of community. For this reason, I would like to remind everyone of our code of conduct. I'm confident that all attendees will benefit from the diversity of our community and will be mindful and respectful of the cultural, ideological, political, and all other forms of diversity that they may encounter throughout the meeting. Furthermore, I sincerely hope that we all have a safe and positive experience here. To help with this, we have appointed an ombuds to address any challenges you may face during the convention. Please do not hesitate to reach out to our ombuds at ombuds@spsp.org, call 949-293-7515, or visit the ombuds office in room E251. Okay. Before I conclude, I would offer one final invitation. I strongly encourage all eligible members to consider volunteering, whether by serving on a committee or contributing as a reviewer for future conventions. If you share SPSP's commitment to innovation, rigor, transparency, and integrity in our science, to constructive scientific dialogue, and to the diversity and inclusivity of both people and ideas, I invite you to become an active part of this community. SPSP relies on the generosity of its members, and our collective work is what allows the society to thrive. I can say from personal experience that serving in these roles is both meaningful and deeply rewarding, and I'm truly grateful for the opportunity. With that, I will conclude and wish you all a fantastic and inspiring convention. Thank you.
Please welcome your 2026 SPSP President from the University of Kansas, Dr. Chris Crandall.
Hi. It's really an honor to be with you and a great crowd of you. I'm glad you've come. It's great to kick off the 26th Annual Convention. I want to begin by thanking Diana Sanchez for her leadership last year as President of SPSP and Cindy Pickett for her recent service as past President. I also want to thank the current Board of Directors who started their terms on January 1 and will help guide us this year. You can find these people with their little black ribbon at the bottom of their name tag that says Board of Directors. You can ask them what's going on and why we do what we do and why we don't do what we don't do. This year's meeting offers an incredible lineup of research designed to advance the science, teaching, and application of personality and social psychology with the ultimate goal of benefiting all. SPSP remains steadfast in its community to be an inclusive and diverse organization, supporting the growth and development of all our members. Today we come together not just to share knowledge, but to celebrate our collective achievements. This convention is an opportunity to reconnect with one another, to recharge our passion for the field, to celebrate the vital contributions of the community. Thank you all for being here. Your dedication to this convention and our discipline is what drives us forward. Now it's time to begin the Presidential Symposium on the Social Personality Psychology, on the Social Personality Psychology addresses the current crises. Today we're fortunate to have two speakers, and it's my pleasure to introduce them. I'll introduce them both at the start. Our first speaker is Rebecca Covarrubias. She's a professor of psychology at UC Santa Cruz and faculty director for the Collaborative Research for Equity and Action, a CREA research group. Her research focuses on topics related to community cultural wealth, educational equity and access, identity in the politics of belonging, and intersectionality and everyday resistance within higher education settings. A first-generation to college graduate, Covarrubias has co-founded and co-led several collectives with a shared mission to bring research, policy, and practice, and to reimagine higher education institutions. Let's give her a pre-round of applause. We'll do this also for Aaron. All right, thank you. Our second speaker is Aaron Halperin. He's a full professor of psychology and head of the psychology department at Hebrew University of Jerusalem. A leading scholar of social and political psychology, he investigates intergroup conflict, collective emotions, prejudice, and the psychological foundations of attitudes towards war, peace, and social change. Halperin has published more than 300 peer-reviewed articles, 6 books, and integrating psychological theory with real-world insights from societies facing protracted conflict. He founded the Accord Center, which advances evidence-based interventions aimed at improving intergroup relations and reducing societal tensions by translating academic research into scalable, practical tools for change. Let's again welcome, let's have a round of applause for Aaron Halperin for coming. Thank you. And let's please welcome our first speaker, Rebecca Covarrubias.
Good morning. First, I want to say that I'm honored to be in conversation with you all today, and I'm humbled by the invitation. Chris, thank you for SPS leadership. And second, I'll just speak really plainly. I don't have to tell you all in this room that we're facing some pretty hard questions right now. I mean, there's deep mistrust in higher education, mistrust in expertise, and mistrust in science itself. And I come to this conversation with a community of scholars, some pictured here, many in this room, and some elsewhere, who have given us some of the most transformative world-building theories, frameworks, and research about how we can reimagine our science, our institutions, and our academy. Scholars who have been marginalized by our institutions have for a long time offered critique of the ways we have been excluded, all the while recognizing the transformative potential of the academy. I run the Collaborative Research for Equity and Action, or CREA, and with a community of scholars, I come to this conversation having spent my career studying institutional betrayal and mistrust, and also learning and implementing how we can build more inclusive universities, especially for and with communities like the one I grew up in, a low-income community of color where almost no one went to college. I am the first and only person in my family to go to college. This is a picture of me at my PhD graduation in social psychology at the University of Arizona. And in the 9 years that I was at the U of A for my undergraduate and graduate degree, my family visited twice. The first time was to drop me off to college, and the second time was actually to see me graduate with a PhD. And at the time, I didn't have language to describe why that might have been the case, but I did have an opportunity to study with Stephanie Freiberg some of the disconnect, including the guilt that I was feeling from the growing chasm between my university reality and the reality of many in my community and neighborhood. And from my position of disconnect and pain that I was experiencing, I offered a new theory about an experience in the literature that was not yet named or understood, and I documented that Latinx students from low-income first-generation backgrounds experience more guilt than their counterparts. And that is really powerful, to give visibility to something that has not yet been visible. And in learning more from the writing of critical psychologists, I see that my research questions, interpretations, and omissions at the time flattened the very lives of the people that I wanted to know most about. This is because guilt is not just a story of inner emotional turmoil. It is a story of institutional betrayal. My family didn't visit the campus because they rejected the value of learning. They rejected the campus because they didn't see themselves reflected in it. And in revisiting my approach, I can humbly say that I did not story the structural factors, familial histories, and cultural wealth, the group nuances in the research. I approached the project almost like I wanted to confirm my assumptions and sort of expectations rather than to honor the full complexity of the lived experience of the participants I cared about. And so I think this is where there is fertile ground for mistrust. Indeed, scholars across different disciplines have long articulated the ways that mistrust happens when research keeps researchers distant from those we study, reduces complex lives to deficit stagnant narratives, locates the problem within individuals and communities, and produces knowledge without relevant direct impact for those communities. And so when I think about when I was in grad school, I didn't lack commitment, desire, motivation. I lacked a framework, a methodology. And I can recognize now that Faithful Witness filled that gap. So Faithful Witness is a methodology put forth by feminists of color, Maria Lugones and Cindy Cruz. And what they articulate and theorize is that faithful witnessing is a relational commitment to listen with humility and accountability to marginalized stories in ways that resist extraction and then unsettle our positions of authority. It's an orientation that takes very seriously our relational obligations for how we produce knowledge about people and communities. It requires not only listening, but recognizing that researchers will always understand very little about everyday life if we focus on a singular story about communities. There's guidance on witnessing faithfully within psychology, other disciplines, and creative works. And the text is small on purpose to show that that work is extensive, and there are many scholars engaging in faithful witnessing using really diverse methods and approaches. And from this work, I synthesized 4 key tenets for today's conversation. So the first is to position our research with and for community rather than on them, which means doing research as a responsible ally and listener, centering the community's knowledge and struggles and not merely treating them as subjects, while being willing to confront our own privilege, discomfort, and growth in that process. The second is to notice acts of resistance, agency, and world building. Every day, people are actively shaping their lives, and there's so much to be learned from those sort of hidden, unconventional actions of self-determination. The third is to acknowledge complexity and to resist deficit unidimensional stories. People's lives hold so many layers of experiences, and this is really about a refusal to reduce communities down to a one-sided narrative of damage, pain, lack, or even resilience. And the final tenet is to stay accountable to analyzing power, meaning to examine how multiple systems of power, oppression, and privilege shape people's lives, shape how they story their lives to us, and shape how we interpret and story their lives. So faithful witness treats research as relational. It assumes that how we know is inseparable from how we stand in relation to others. And so for the rest of the talk, what I'd like to do is operationalize faithful witnessing through 3 guiding questions. And so the first set of questions is who's involved, how, and why. And the goal here is to really direct our attention to power, participation, and positionality, asking whose perspectives are included and considered. The second set of questions are what is the research question and what theory and method are we using to understand it and why? Research questions are not neutral. Theories make some things visible and render invisible other things, and our methods are ethical choices. And then finally, what interpretations do we draw and who are they accountable to? Interpretation is also an act of power. So is what we decide to do with our interpretations and findings, including asking who is impacted and who benefits. I'm going to give one illustrative research example and give a really broad overview, and I picked this both because of the relevancy of faithful witnessing for me, but also because I think it offers different entry points for our different roles as researchers, mentors, teachers, and campus leaders. So UC Santa Cruz is the context for this project. It is a Hispanic-serving research institution, which means that it's a research-intensive university that enrolls large numbers of marginalized students and is therefore eligible for federal funding, which has now been stripped away by the government. These funds, however, help institutions build capacity and equity programming for serving students' holistic needs through culturally validating practices. And the work is especially important because many of these institutions are also historically white systems, meaning that even though institutional demographics have shifted, much of the institutional structures and organizational identities have not. So there has to be really intentional culture shift work to think about that mission of servingness. And although there are many programs and opportunities designed to support students within these contexts, students still report structural challenges related to access, racism, classism, and broader systemic inequities. So I thought about what it meant to build a participatory research structure as a culturally validating practice. And I've now worked with 3 separate teams, and this is one of those teams. And so to begin, we recruited 11 undergraduate students from really diverse racial, ethnic, first-generation social class backgrounds and campus majors. And we focused on those who had not yet had access to research. And our goal here was to broaden access to a high-impact, fully paid research training experience. Using a participatory research design, we worked to really shift the traditional power dynamics within research collaboration. So students who have been historically excluded from knowledge production were situated as the experts. And so they shaped the project from defining the research question to deciding what action, if any, they wanted to take. So Kat Quinteros, a graduate student mentor, and I served as facilitators. We asked reflective questions and provided tools such as literature reviews and guidance and methods training. while centering students' agency and self-determination throughout the entire process. So it's from that foundation that the students developed a research question focused on support structures within HSRIs for marginalized students. And their priority was to study validation, what it means and why it matters in this context. So their question is, what are the culturally invalidating or validating practices that make resources inaccessible or accessible for marginalized students? They were committed to examining both what is not working and what is working, to offer a more complex and honest picture of how HSRIs are serving marginalized students. They decided on Rendon's cultural validation theory, which is connected to affirmation, validation, and cultural matching in social psychology. And the theory emphasizes that students thrive when institutions actively recognize, affirm, and respond to their cultural identities and backgrounds. Again, the students wanted more nuance. So rather than focus on validation within a single setting, like a classroom setting, they wanted to understand validation across the entire university ecosystem. So they deeply understood how navigating an institution is a confusing, bureaucratic place without insider knowledge. And so they wanted to know where were the disconnects and supports along those pathways in the different domains of students' lives. So after much discussion, they chose in-depth interviews to really talk to first-generation students about their experiences navigating campus resources. And they used reflexive thematic analysis, which is a bottom-up inductive approach that prioritizes participants' accounts, while also leaving room for their own reflections, diverse positionalities, and sense-making for making sense of the data. And so rather than pull out a single theme without context, I'll just give a broad summary of some of the findings they constructed. So participants described navigating a bureaucratic and confusing campus system, including finding that many resources were underfunded and scarce, competitive to access, or even just invisible or not known. Like, what does it mean to access a research opportunity within an HSRI? When faculty and staff made proactive attempts to outreach to students, and encourage their involvement on campus, this both empowered students to use those resources, but also made them feel like they cared, like someone invested in them. And importantly, first-generation participants who worked on campus shared that they played a critical role in helping their peers navigate the campus, including the politics of who to go to for support and who not to go to. So we thought a lot about who the research is accountable to and how the research is answerable to communities. So I want to give a range of examples here. The first is that we were accountable to the careers of the undergraduate students and the graduate student mentor. So the team presented for the first time at local and national conferences. They chose to draft a manuscript, which is now under review, and I have to say it's one of the best writing experiences of my career. And we nominated them for a department award, which is typically actually reserved for individual researchers, and they were the first team to receive it as a team. We were also accountable to their own goals for the research, so they wanted to generate campus-wide conversation with leaders on how to make resources more accessible and culturally validating. So they produced accessible materials like research infographics to reach a wide audience. They gave several campus talks, including one for the HSI Equity Series, and their work was highlighted as a transformative practice for our Teaching and Learning Center. These venues, again, typically feature individual scholars, mostly faculty, and the team was the first to be showcased collectively, challenging really the individualistic notion of knowledge production and showing that research production is truly a collaborative endeavor. As part of my leadership role in the HSI Research Colectiva, this is a national network of HSI scholars, I helped co-organize and host a convening at UC Davis. And we invited policymakers, community organizers, campus administrators, staff, and faculty to engage in conversation how we can bridge policy, practice, and research to advance educational equity within HSIs in California. And the conference featured the work of the undergraduate team. This is their world building in action. They presented their research-informed recommendations to the entire room of folks who have direct interest and influence on institutional and state policy. And then finally, I think a lot about my own sort of position and role and responsibility as an educator, and I have been thinking about what it means to teach right now, especially now. What does it mean to teach with impact? And so for the last several years, I've been learning from the PARC curriculum and trying to scale it within the 300-person research methods class in psychology. And the class is not possible without large teams of graduate student teaching assistants who bring some of the most innovative, inclusive ideas for building participatory community learning spaces that are rigorous. So in 10 weeks, across 12 sections of about 27 students, each class comes and with the TA focuses on coming up with a single research question focused on educational equity. And these are just some questions on the left. And then students apply the tools that they learn in lecture to then execute their research project. And they develop skills in APA writing, but as their final project, what they're learning is to translate those research findings into accessible formats, including research briefs and infographics. And what they're doing is trying to make those ready to share with the campus and also broader community, including their families. It's been a conscious decision to do this kind of redesign. It's challenging for a lot of reasons, and I feel inspired and grateful by what the teaching team commits and guides and what the students are producing. And I have to say that what I have learned from what they've produced and across my career is that what students care most about is that they belong, are included, and truly matter as people within our learning spaces. So this is where I'd like to come back to this original question about building back trust and end with a few key takeaways about what we need during these moments of crisis to sort of reaffirm the public value of our science. My first takeaway is that we need to expand our criteria for how we think about impact, significance, and rigor of our own psychological science. We should be designing standards around collective contribution and public impact. In August 2023, faculty at UC Santa Cruz led a grassroots effort to create guidelines for recognizing community-engaged work and public scholarship as part of tenure and promotion guidelines. They were expanding metrics for what gets rewarded as rigorous, impactful scholarship. I'll just offer a few examples. To what extent did the research engage the community through collaborative processes built on trust, respect, and reciprocity? How effectively and in what forms has the research knowledge been translated for external and public audiences? And how did the findings get translated into durable, public-facing practices that continue to advance community goals, influence practice, or promote equity and inclusion? I mean, this is a visionary model with many implications for how our field can begin to value and recognize the rigor of science that is relational, designed with and for community, and rooted in approaches that remain accountable to those communities. My second takeaway is that faithful witnessing is always a collective endeavor. Imagine the force, the impact, the havoc that we could unleash as social psychologists if we did more serious, coordinated collective work. We have to do away with this idea of the lone genius, or regarding first and sole author as sort of the gold standards for excellence. I think rebuilding trust requires different structures altogether. I mean, research collectors are not about being more efficient in times of crisis. They are mobilizing infrastructures. They're necessary for solving wicked problems. The most complex problems that we study, polarization, inequality, climate justice, structural racism, poverty, are extremely complex and interconnected, and they resist simple solutions. If what we study is so complex, why would our research infrastructures remain so individualistic? The question, I think, is not whether we are capable of building them, but whether we are willing to let go of structures that keep us siloed and alone. And then when things feel too big and hopeless, I believe faithful witness is in the everyday choices, how we listen, the stories we craft, the theories we embrace, what we read and focus on, the goals we set for our research, how we mentor, and how we share our findings, and to whom. And I think these small intentional acts are some of the most transformative places to start. And there are examples of how to do this within our own discipline. I mean, psychologists are doing rigorous work collaborating with communities. They're facilitating community-driven research and articulating how even an experimental debriefing to a single participant can be its own form of public engagement. If that student only learned about that study one time, what would we be communicating about the value of psychological research and what we do as psychologists? So right now, social psychology is being asked difficult questions. And in these compounding crises, I recognize that we're sort of navigating some familiar and unfamiliar terrain. And I think crises have a way of sort of articulating and clarifying what has not been working. And from generations of scholars, communities, and families like my own, I have learned that in that space, we can reimagine and rebuild anew. And so faithful witness does not offer a quick repair. It offers generational wisdom for reimagining rigor that is relational, interpretation that is accountable, and research that answers to the lives we study. Thank you.
Please give a warm welcome to Aaron Halperin.
Wow. Hi, everyone. First of all, thank you, Chris, for inviting me and for choosing this highly important theme for this session, and Rebecca for an amazing, really amazing talk. I will say that probably, the more reasonable thing on my side would have been, to talk about my research, present data, talk about answers that we have to questions as someone who's studying intergroup conflict for so many years. But I feel that it's simply impossible at that time. I've witnessed so much suffering, lost so many friends, Israelis and Palestinians, and I feel too sad in order to act as business as usual and simply present more data, more studies, and act as if I have answers in my research or in our research to the challenges of the world and to the challenges that we encounter in our area in the recent two and a half years. So what I'm going to do in the time that I have is slightly different. I'm going to raise questions, and I want to invite you into my head. I want to invite you to conversations that I had in my head, but to some extent with you, my colleagues, my friends, in the last 2.5 years. Conversations in which I mainly asked, and I'm going to repeat this question again and again and again, what are we supposed to do? What is our role as social and political, in my case, political psychology, studying intergroup conflict when the world gets crazy, when so many people get killed, when groups harm each other in a way that cannot be imagined? And that's what I want to talk about this afternoon. For those of you who don't know me, and many of you probably don't know me, so I'm a professor of social and political psychology. That's a picture of mine 25 years ago. I was very severely injured in another round of violence in our area in the Middle East. I was hospitalized for more than 3 years. I lost functioning in both of my hands. And back then, I decided that I'm going to devote my life. I didn't know that it's going to be through science and research and social psychology, but I'm going to devote my life to try and reduce the suffering of people who experience things that are similar to the thing that I've experienced. Then, at some point, I realized that maybe, research and science can add something that people don't think about usually. And since then, for more than 20 years, I've studied the psychology of intergroup conflict, but mostly with a focus on trying to reduce violence, in the case of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, in an attempt to promote peaceful resolution to this conflict and an end to the occupation. And still, when the war started, I must admit that I was unprepared for the shock of living through the very hatred, dehumanization, and radicalization I had studied throughout my life. I knew about these concepts. I've studied these concepts. I couldn't imagine that ordinary people, mainstream individuals, can go to such extreme in support, in violence on both sides of the conflict, and it's definitely not an asymmetrical conflict. And as I said at the beginning, I kept on asking myself the same question. I woke up every morning, and the first thought that I had in mind, and to some extent I still do, was, I can't believe that my kids are living in such world, that my kids are waking up every morning and see these, killing and suffering around us. And the second thought that went through my head was, what am I supposed to do? From a historical perspective, when people would look back at these times and look at people who are coming from our profession, scientists, social psychologists, political psychologists, who study intergroup conflict, what are we supposed to do when we wake up in the morning and we live as part of an area of people who are simply killing each other every morning? And as a good or not so good social and political psychologist, I had three options. I must admit, I said at the beginning, I don't have clear answers to these questions. And to some extent, the answers I gave myself changed every morning. Every morning, the answers I gave myself changed, and I don't think that I have the optimal answer, not even now. But when I prepared this talk, I thought of it as something that we can think of in the framework of like fight, flight, or freeze, and I'll try to explain what I mean. The first option that I must admit is very tempting is the freeze option. The freeze option, and I can think of different versions of this freeze option, basically saying it's not time for research. I mean, and again, I created with AI this visual, but basically saying, let's close the door of our lab, and let's say, can you really think of, 2x2 design, sample size, power calculations, and things like that, when the reality outside is so crazy? Let's, pause, take some perspective. Let's get back to research when the world would become normal again, if it would happen. But that's not time to do research. And honestly, I would say there were many, many mornings in which I said, that's not the time to do science. That's not the time to do research. Let's do something different. Another version of this freeze option was a version that said, okay, let's shut the door of our lab, but let's behave as a responsible citizen. Let's go out to the street. Let's protest against our government. Let's try to stop this war and stop the killing and do something, but not as a researcher, because I freeze as a researcher right now. Do it as a responsible citizen who wants to promote peaceful relations between these groups. I will say this freeze option is very tempting. From my perspective, on my better mornings, I would say, it wasn't a real option. It wasn't a real option because I was prepared my entire life to try and do something, modestly, and the freeze option wasn't really an option. The second option, the flight option, is even more sensitive. I don't think that many people, talk about it in public, but I think that it should be discussed in public. And I will say that the flight option combines both my personal thoughts, but also my research directions. And that's the idea of saying, asking, what is the point in life in which one should tell himself or herself, I cannot be part of this situation anymore. I simply cannot be part of this situation anymore. In my case, I cannot be part of the Israeli society anymore. Is there a point in which the reality around me would lead me to say, you need to flight? I mean, that's what we need to do. And what you see here is sometimes we treat ourselves by doing research. So in that case, instead of just talking to myself in front of the mirror, we got a grant and we started studying this concept of what is called national disidentification. And we asked, what can lead people to say, to the point in which they will say, I want to disidentify from my national group, the identity that in many ways have defined me throughout my entire life, but I cannot be part of it anymore. This is Naomi Sternberg, who led this project. I just want to mention two interesting things about that. One is that in a survey we conducted in Israel during the war, almost 50% of our Jewish Israeli participants scored above the midpoint of the scale, saying we seriously consider in our mind disidentifying from our national group. We have very similar results from, by the way, from a US sample, but also from other samples. This paper can be found as a preprint. It's still under review. But the second point, which is more important, at least for me, was the understanding of what's the psychological turning point. And the psychological turning point was the point in which people said, you know what? My society has changed its face. It changed its nature, but also it's irreversible. There's a new us that will never get back to what we've been before. And that's the point in which people, they do not necessarily physically immigrate from their country, but they psychologically immigrate and distance themselves from the group. So that's the second option. That's the flight option. And the third option, which I must admit, for me, it's the more intuitive one, and that's what I try to do throughout my life. It's not fight in the sense of, fighting, because fighting can have very negative connotations when we speak about conflict, but it's trying to use research, to use science in order to change the situation. And that's, of course, Kurt Lewin and his, very, 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 very famous quotes, basically talking about research and action as one. And that's for me, that's the main inspiration for everything I've done, even before the war in Gaza started, but definitely after the war started. I will say, I know that you can't see the text at the bottom of the slide, but my question, and I still ask this question, is whether this can really be done during war. I mean, whether we can really be effective in reducing hatred, dehumanization, support for violence, and radicalization during war. It is still an open question for me. As I said before, I don't have definite answers. I can only, try to describe what we have tried to do during the last 2.5 years. So for us, I'm going to take 4 or 5 minutes just to describe the attempt we've done, and it's basically an integration of 2 different arms. What you see here is, let's see if I can. So that's the research arm. PICR is my research lab at the Hebrew University, Psychology of Intergroup Conflict and Reconciliation lab, and Accord is our applied center. Accord Social Psychology for Social Change. And the idea was during the war to create a system of integrative work between the lab and the applied centers. So in the lab, we ran, I counted for this talk, more than 20 different intervention tournaments that attempted to change or to examine what would be effective in changing Israelis' attitudes or motivations or support for policies that we defined as desired outcome. I'm going to describe them in 2 minutes. It was accompanied by some focus groups and correlational studies, but 20 different projects that basically try to identify the most effective messages and processes that can maybe mobilize public opinion in Israel in a direction that would stop the war and stop the violence. And at the same time, the team in Accord now, there are 65 people that are working. Most of them are not researchers. They take the knowledge that we create in the lab and make it accessible to people who are on the ground and are trying to make real change in the Israeli society. So we're talking about people that are working in the media, NGOs, politicians, anyone that can be relevant. And the idea is to package these hopefully effective messages or processes in a way that is ready to use for these people and help them to make or to try and make some kind of influence or some kind of change within the Israeli society. I don't have too much time, but I want to give you just a taste of what kind of things we have tried to change using this integration of the 2 arms, of the research arm and the applied arm. Yes. So just examples, most of the things that you see here are already published scientifically, although I must say that the science side of this was just a tool. At the end of the day, publishing papers wasn't the goal when we did these things during the war, but it was important for us to somehow bring it out to the scientific community as well. So very large effort was an effort to try and support the protest. The protest, our assumption was that the protest can really stop the war or influence the Israeli government to stop the war. Eric Schumann is sitting here. Eric's work on what kind of protest would be effective, and the basic idea of constructive disruption was very, very useful for us. And then Noah, who developed the idea of, how do you create sense of momentum to make sure that protest can sustain for a very, very long time. So in this case, our work with the protest leaders and the NGOs that led the protest was very, very, very close. The actions of the protest, the messages of the protest, many things that they've done were basically designed in our lab, and you can see some of them in the papers that are cited here. Eric's work here is more the conceptual idea. Noah's work is a large-scale intervention tournament that was meant to find ways to maintain the momentum of the protest. So these are just examples for things that we've done on that side. Another thing, I'll give just two more examples. Another thing, immediately when the war started, we realized that probably the biggest psychological challenge within the Israeli society was the idea of increased sense of homogeneity of Palestinians. Basically, Israelis, many Israelis, many mainstream Israelis that basically said, all Palestinians are the Hamas people you saw on October 7th. There's no difference, there's no moderate or extremists among the Palestinians. So immediately, like a week after the war erupted, we conducted a very, very large-scale intervention tournament led by Ilana Ushimirsky that tried to identify messages that can lead Israelis to understand that there are, different subgroups within the Palestinian society, that the Palestinian society is much more heterogeneous than what they thought. This paper is already published. And I'll just give two more examples. Several intervention tournaments that tried to design messages that would help people who are trying to mobilize support for the end of the war. Israelis were, there was a question, what's more important? Is it more important to stop the war, bring back the hostages, and move forward, or to try and win, the complete win, as they said, of Hamas? So we tried to design messages that would do the first thing. And the second thing that I find very, very important were series of studies, series of intervention tournaments that were meant to try and promote tolerance for critical voices within the Israeli society. One of the main things that happened immediately after the war started was silencing of both critical voices from the Jewish side, but mainly critical voices among the Palestinian citizens of Israel. And Lee Eldar and others have promoted studies that basically designed messages to create more support for what we call tolerance for critical voices. I'm going to stop the examples here because I want to talk about the insights that we've gained based on these attempts. And again, we've done it on a weekly basis, both the studies and the applications. Some of it was successful, most of it was not successful. I should be said and be very, very honest about that. So I want to talk about some insights that we have. The first thing, and again, I was surprised, I was under the impression for so many years, that we can find solutions. We know how the psychology of people work. We know how to design interventions. We can find ways to mobilize the public if needed. The first thing I think that we've learned is modesty. The effect sizes we got were relatively small. Many studies ended up with null results, and it was very, very difficult to change people's mindsets, immediately after the war started. The second thing was the understanding that we should treat our results, the results of our intervention studies, not as a full-scale intervention, but only as a proof of concept. So even if the effect sizes are very small, we have some indication, some initial indication to things that maybe potentially can work if people will talk about them again and again and again repeatedly when they are interviewed in the mainstream media in Israel. So even things that yielded very, very small effect sizes were found effective in the field. The third thing was this challenge of using knowledge from our research, among influentials in the field. So some things that were found very, very effective in our lab were things that people, the people in the studios, the politicians, the NGOs said, you know what? I'm not going to use it. I cannot use it. I'm too afraid of being punished by the mainstream society, so I can't use your results or your messages, even though they seem effective. They are effective in making effects on other people, but they will damage me as a politician, as a communicator. I mean, it's simply not good enough for me. And then we realize that we have to work together with the people on the ground to help them to package things, and also sometimes to test in our intervention tournaments, not just if these messages or ideas have an effect on our outcome, like the dependent variable, but also does it have positive effect for the people that would actually use them. I want to finalize with some general insights. I'm not sure that I'll have the time to go over everything, but I want to emphasize 2 or 3 of them. The first thing is that at the end of the day, when I look retrospectively, the things that actually worked and were effective were simply going back to the fundamentals of social psychology, like increasing sense of heterogeneity, increasing the understanding that groups are more malleable than what people thought about before, differentiating between the extremist and the more moderate people, understanding the power of the context. So eventually we didn't have to invent anything new, but just go back to the fundamentals of our field. The second thing was a thin line between helping people during war to understand the processes and legitimizing the violence. So at the beginning of the war, we thought that it would be good for both Israelis and Palestinians simply to understand what's happening. And then at some point, we realized that by doing this, we're very close to the point in which we're saying, that's okay, because if social psychology can explain why do people behave that way in these situations, so maybe it's fine. Maybe we shouldn't have different expectations from people. I say that my time is off, so I'll just mention 2 last things very, very, very briefly. One is our role in trying to introduce a more complex picture of reality. One of the things that simply didn't happen, not within Israel, not among the Palestinians, not in the international community, are people that are saying, you can say both things. I don't know. You can say the occupation is a terrible thing that created the background for October 7th, and at the same time you can say October 7th and the things that happened there are terrible and inhuman and no one can accept it, and at the same time you can say Israel's reactions to that was unproportional and shouldn't be accepted by anyone. I think that scientists have the role to look, as external observers of the situation and to try and present a more complex pictures than what other people do, mainly people that are involved within that situation. And I will just finish with the one last thing that I have to say. I don't have the answers to what we should do during these kind of terrible times, but I have one thing to say, and that's that we should never, never, never stop asking, what should we do? Thank you very much.
All right, great. Thank you for being here. And what a great pair of talks this was. And I want to enter. Super great. And we want to entertain questions. And there are microphones up the front, and hopefully we'll do that. We can't really see you, so you really will have to come up to the microphone for any questions that you have. I know they're out there. Please go right up to the microphone.
Oh, sorry, that better? Okay. When you studied the dissatisfaction among Israeli society, I was wondering, did you explore the differences between different ethnic groups within the Jewish community, so looking at where they're from, and how recently they had immigrated? Because I know with the increase in anti-Semitism in America and Europe, there's been a lot of Jews fleeing those countries to Israel. So did you see any differences in their perspectives as well as recent immigrants or people who've immigrated from Arab countries in their feelings of dissatisfaction?
So I don't think that we have such data. It's something that's really interesting and we can definitely explore. I think that the one thing that really surprised us, both when looking at the Israeli data and the American data, now we're doing these similar studies in Hungary and Poland, and we've done some work in Ukraine as well, is that national disidentification, at least on the psychological or mental like aspect of it, was prevalent among the mainstream. Among the mainstream of these societies, not just among new immigrants, not just among people that are group disidentification has been studied among immigrants, for example, and among refugees, but not among the mainstream of the society. And I think that many democratic societies, definitely the Israeli society, but also other societies, are going through such dramatic changes in recent years that at least some people are asking themselves, can I really be part of it? I mean, do I want to be part of it? Can I be part of it? Can I still define myself through the identity of this specific group? And my main surprise was that it was mainly among the mainstream.
And I had one more question. When you were looking at when you were doing this study to sort of bridge the gap to create peace, how did you present the data related to Palestinian beliefs? Like, where did that research come from, the diversity of their beliefs? And how did you get access to the diversity of their opinions? And how prevalent is the diversity of the Palestinians' opinions when you're presenting it to the Israelis?
So you're asking what was the basis for the information we've used as part of our interventions?
Yes, because from what just what I've seen is so much of the UNRWA indoctrination of the Palestinians, and when we have indoctrination, we know how that affects populations at large. We can look through historically how when we have mass education programs, they impact the society's view of a group, right? So how do you get that data of the Palestinian diversity of opinion, given what UNRWA has done over the past several generations?
So I will say that, at least in my view, you get these mass education programs among any society involved in conflict. I don't think that it's specific to the Palestinian society. I think that you can see the same thing or very similar things among the Israeli Jewish society and among other societies. But that's not really the point, at least from my perspective. The point from my perspective is that I think that we all understand that outgroups are usually more heterogeneous than what in-group think or the way in-group perceive them. And our goal was simply to highlight that idea. It doesn't have to be by highlighting the actual differences in opinions among the Arab society. I can give you an example from Ilana's work that was published in PSPB. Part of it was to emphasize or to highlight internal criticism within the Palestinian society on things that happened during the war. And these things amplified Israelis' understanding that there are different voices within the Palestinian society.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you. I loved both talks, but a question for Rebecca. So what counts as community seems fairly straightforward if you're studying a particular community or if you're aimed at doing participatory research with students, but I wonder what advice you have for people who don't study a particular community. Like how would you define a community or think about how to recruit people for participatory research?
Oh, that's such a good question. Thank you for that. Yeah, I actually purposely picked the example of the university community, just sort of to play with the boundaries of what community can be. And even the community engaged guidelines at our campus is more referring to actually anything outside of the university setting. But I think we need sort of broader understandings of that. And the participatory action research, it is a particular methodology, but there's, other kinds of methodologies that just think about participation and sort of different levels of that, from really meaningful consultation to this sort of more kind of empowering participatory kinds of approaches. So there's lots of sort of, I think, options and sort of variabilities depending on how you're kind of situated within your work and with also working with communities. So I guess all that to say that at least I think about it as sort of a very flexible way of not only think about community, but the biggest thing is how are we sort of in relation to that? So even when we're doing consulting to maybe develop some of our tools, Is it sort of meaningful consultation, or is it sort of like, we'll ask a bit and sort of like a checklist, which is a very different way of like relating to maybe who we're talking about and who. I really like that final study too around that idea that even a debriefing or how you introduce your study can be public engagement. So again, that if like a student never did another psychology study and just did one, that they have a kind of clear understanding about what social psychologists do. So I know I see it as sort of different entry points. I think it's also the case that it has to be really intentional because obviously there's been long histories where people sort of go into communities with maybe different intentions, and there's been sort of mistrust and sort of not regard for those communities. So, I mean, I guess I would start with the question of like, intention and where you want to be and who do you want to relate to, and from there I think there's lots of models and frameworks and approaches to take from that, and that it feels like a really good starting place to me. That's a great question. Thank you.
Let's go for Jimena and then,
Marcus, you go ahead.
oh, Marcus.
I have a similar question for you, Rebecca. I loved your guidelines for tenure and promotion. I think there's a similar idea by a researcher at Michigan State University. How will that work practically? Like, take our colleagues, cognitive psychology, biological psychology. If we come along and suggest, hey, new tenure guidelines, community-engaged research, and you have to show how your research has been implemented in practice in the real world, and that helps your promotion. I don't think we're going to get that through the departmental faculty meeting as new tenure guidelines. How are you imagining that concretely?
I mean, I will say that those guidelines, I mean, they took a big effort, and it was sort of recognizing work that was already happening on campus, and they're actually only used for people who identify themselves as being community-engaged research. So it's not sort of intended to actually evaluate folks who don't identify doing that work. But I will say that we have a grant now that we're working on through the Center for Reimagined Leadership, where it's taking a much broader approach around what public scholarship is, and broadening it that so it's not just this focus on community engaged, because that is its own really intensive training and methodology that also shouldn't be sort of misunderstood and co-opted, but that with public scholarship, right now it's sort of a 2-year process where, again, ground up, trying to consult with different departments to understand what are the various forms of public scholarship across different kinds of disciplines and departments, and what can we sort of recognize within our tenure and promotion and sort of value. So I think in this case, it's taking a much broader approach. I also will say that even though we have those guidelines, it's messy. Like, it's really hard to actually implement them in discussions, because I think we're used to a particular thing, so it does take time. Like, even in our department conversations, there's a lot of commitment, but yeah, it's hard. Yeah, thanks for that.
Jimena?
First, I want to thank you both for fantastic talks, and I want to recognize Chris for putting this together, so thank you very much. So this is very related to Marcus's question. You're each in nations with diverse institutions of higher education that have different values. How do you make the case to your administration? So within your university, do you feel that your research is valued? And what advice would you have for making the case that it's relevant and necessary to study these things to your administrators?
Yeah, it's so complicated. I'll say that for a long time I was ready to leave academia because I felt like the work that I wanted to do wouldn't be recognized. And luckily I had, at least kind of spaces where that wasn't the case. I actually actively picked going to somewhere like UC Santa Cruz because the department itself does value that work. Like, I didn't feel like I needed to leave parts of myself behind to do the research that I wanted to do, and that I could do the sort of public impact work. And that's a commitment that I don't take lightly. And at the same time, what I've learned in these sort of ground up processes is that with even the faculty who did the community engaged guidelines, and now in this process of public scholarship work, that kind of, again, this sort of mobilizing force of faculty when there's really strong recommendations that come from that kind of collective voice, our administration listens. And I've had some experience doing some work on faculty of color leadership and designing 3-part series that was this campus-wide conversation. And I think it is about developing the sort of, it matters that it's ground up, and it matters that you're speaking for a collective voice. I don't mean that everyone feels the same. I just mean that you've done the work of sort of listening, generating, and then giving sort of recommendations. So some of it is that our context is really well suited for that, but some of it is that it's a lot of work, I think, to build that kind of coalition for thinking about changing structures that are very embedded for a long time.
I'll answer, yeah, it's okay. I'll answer very briefly. I get the sense, I have some experience in looking at different universities, different administrations, and I get the sense that the more the social and political challenges become, difficult, the easier it is to make the case that our scientific work must address these challenges. I mean, because otherwise there's a gap or a mismatch that simply doesn't make sense. I mean, everyone acknowledges that we have huge challenges today in terms of violent conflict, polarization, conspiracy theories. I mean, so many things. And then to say that we won't use our scientific work in order to address these challenges, something doesn't make sense in making the academia relevant. And I feel that it gets easier as the years go by and easier as the challenges become more difficult.
Mm-hmm. I do want to mention that the landscape of American academia is not moving in that direction, but the challenges are increased and the desire to have relevant research has receded in many public universities and private. Can we please go ahead?
Sure. Thank you both so much. Very inspiring work and excellent talks. In talking about messages, you mentioned we, as scientists, would like to play in complexity. And you suggested that our messages should invite complexity when we're giving messages to the public. Oftentimes, simple and brief messages win the day. So do you have any thoughts about how we can translate complexity into something that's more digestible? Thank you.
It's a great question, and I think that, at least from my experience, it's a great question because I have so much experience in developing messages that were effective in the lab but simply couldn't be used in the field. And I think that the best advice that I have in that sense is that the people who should use these messages or ideas at the end of the chain must be involved in the process from day one. That's the most important thing. They should be there because they're the ones who should be able to say, these things I simply cannot use. These things would not be, persuasive enough from our perspective. These things for our platform are not relevant, although, in a social psychological study, they can seem very, very effective. So the best advice I can give is that they simply have to be involved from the first moment.
Hi, I'm Nohea Begay. I'm a sophomore at the University of New Mexico, majoring in Native American Studies and Sociology. I guess this question could go towards both of you, but I wanted to ask how building community within, especially within social psychology and sociology, where we do discuss social issues that can be very difficult to go into, especially as an individual, how does participatory-based research, as well as doing research as a team, how do you think that negates kind of that aloneness of going through researching these social issues? How does that help with building community and rebuilding that trust and relationality within the social sciences, but then also with the public when we work together within, working with the community, but then also working in teams?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's so interesting because earlier in my career, I was like thinking about publications, training, getting the job, and it's so clear to me now that in all the work that I've been able to do and have the opportunity to meet all these different groups at a place like UC Santa Cruz, that again, fundamentally, it's the relationships because there's deep presence. You really are investing in each other. You're getting to know each other, people know that they care, and I think just by it is that, I think, that fundamental, actually. And it's interesting because I come to a space like SPSP, and I'm so excited to see people, and it can also feel like a very isolating place, like you don't feel like you belong here, but it's sort of the relationships that really root you into something and really connect you into something. So, I mean, your question in some ways answered itself, because I sort of am sharing what you're thinking about, is that, and I think that's the way to sort of counter this lie about individualism. It is a lie. Like, none of our research is individualistic. We are always in conversation, reading something, watching movies, TVs, thinking in community, and we come from generations of people that have taught us something. So I think being in that relationship sort of remind us about that lie, and that we are so much more sort of connected, generative, I think productive, and I don't mean that in a very narrow way, when we can at least recognize that we need community. So yeah, I really love this question, but it does feel sort of that like simple. Not that it is, because relationships are also really complicated and take a lot of time, which kind of rubs up against a bit to what our work is sometimes.
Thank you. Terry.
Eran, thank you both for very interesting talks. Eran, I was wondering if you, can you not hear? Sorry. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about the nearly half of your sample that disidentifies. Who are they? And does that have consequences for the outcomes you're interested in any way, as a moderator or whatever?
Yeah, I think that first of all, we've done this study in many different countries. I think that the most important thing is that the people who are on the higher ends of this scale or this measure basically are despaired. They're basically people who are saying we don't believe that we can change the situation. It's irreversible. And that's probably the most important thing we should know about them, because they're basically saying, okay, so no reason to go out to the streets and protest. There's no reason to try, there is a reason, but it's simply not going to work. And I think that they've crossed this line between saying, we're really angry at our government or country or whatever, but we're going to do all we can in order to change it, versus saying, we've done everything we can, it's not going to work anymore. And since it's not going to work anymore, and furthermore, it's people who got enough indications that are saying this thing that happened to our country or society, or it's not temporary. That's a new us. And I think that's a very interesting insight.
Hi, thank you both for the talks. They were both really great. I have a question for you, Eran. You laid out this expectation that both groups should engage in some sort of self-criticism, but when, the violence is clearly asymmetrical, as you said, in some cases, some people are just trying to survive, right? And so my question is the expectation for what we should do, as you laid out at the end, equal on both sides when the violence is asymmetrical? And to further, to a secondary question, what should we do to get to the point where both sides can be equally, self-critical?
No, first of all, thanks for the question. I want to emphasize, I didn't say that both sides should be equally self-critical. I said it is important to somehow, to manage to contain a very complex view of the reality. And these are different things. Part of it is to acknowledge the asymmetrical nature of the conflict and the asymmetrical nature of the violence. It's part of looking at it as a more complex situation. Because I think that in most cases, you look at it now from an outside and you say, Israelis are the more powerful side, Palestinians, but talk to Israelis, their view is very, very different, very different. And the complexity here is to acknowledge the asymmetrical nature of the situation, and also ask each and every side to look at its own role within the situation. It doesn't mean, and it doesn't imply in any way, that the role of the sides, not in this conflict and not in other conflict, is equal or symmetrical in any way.
Thank you.
Are we at our time? I'm sorry. We've reached the end of our time, and I hope our first of all, I want to congratulate our speakers for great talks and thank them very much for being here. And hopefully both will stick around a little bit if you have more questions. I'm sorry we were unable to get to all of them, but you'll be here for just a bit at least. And again, thank you all for coming. I have a final thing. In addition to the talks, we hope, no. I'm going to skip the thing. Thank you for coming. Come on up and say hello if you can. Enjoy the rest of the convention.